All right, everyone that's joined us, thank you for coming. The numbers are still coming up. People are introducing themselves here in the chat. Wow, we have like a really large geographic spread of people. That's really awesome. Thank you for the people from European countries as well. It's quite late, especially like 9 p.m. local here in the UK. I see quite a few places from England there. And then into like Central Europe as well. And of course, good morning to everybody in America. My name is Scott. I am the founder of Report URI, and thank you very much for joining us. And with me, I have a very good friend and guest, Troy Hunt. So, Troy, if you want to do a quick intro and introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, g'day. Welcome to only me from Australia so far by the look of it, 6 a.m. in Australia. I'm Troy Hunt. I started Have I Been Pwned.com, which is now only accessible over HTTPS. So I think we'll come back to that. So I do that. And you and I have been doing some Report URI things for a while too. So this is me early in the day, 2 coffees in.
2 coffees in by this time. What are you on, 6 a.m. local?
Yeah. I started.
Of course. All right. So we're here today to run this webinar. And for those that have maybe joined one of our previous webinars or seen anything that Troy and I do, it's not your typical kind of formal businessy webinar. They're pretty laid back and informative. And we're going to be taking a look at the British Airways Magecart breach. Now, this did happen a few years ago, but the reason that we picked this particular incident or breach, is that it was one of the most notable events of this type. And it is also one of the #1 things that we help people protect against at Report URI. Magecart have become really, really kind of prolific from around about 2014-15 onwards. And what they focus on is stealing huge amounts of credit card data from websites with an e-commerce component. Now, we'll go a little bit more into Magecart and how they kind of operate, how they conduct these attacks. But to get started and kind of outline, I guess, the problem, first of all, we need to kind of understand how a web page is built. So, Troy, like, what is the process that a browser goes through to build a page? Like, how do we see this page that we have in front of us now?
I'm glad you asked, because I went and grabbed a prop beforehand.
Nice.
This is first of all, this is a serious book. This is the book that I bought in 1995 to learn how to build web pages. And I find it quite interesting to break this out, because what I started doing then, when I discovered that I couldn't do any web development courses at university because it kind of didn't exist yet. When you look back at this now, pretty much everything is still relevant from 1995, like almost 3 decades on, except for blink and marquee tags. We don't talk about those anymore. But for the most part, the construction of a page being HTML with a whole bunch of external assets, usually CSS, images, and JavaScript, I think is probably a predominant category of dependencies. Everything pretty much works the same way today as what it did then. And I just, first of all, I find it kind of fascinating that something built in that simple era has actually translated all the way through to an era where we're doing high-def video calls for free, and then the AI is probably doing something in there too. But I think what's interesting, particularly now, is that we have so many downstream dependencies. So you build a web application, and even Have I Been Pwned, which is now a decade old in and of itself, that website loads, the HTML loads, and then all of the dependencies beneath that come down. And some of the things come from Have I Been Pwned and their images in JavaScript and so on. And then some of them come from Cloudflare's CDN, and then some of them come from Cloudflare. And there's all these little sort of tentacles that reach down from the page into all these other different assets of different types. And I think it's fascinating. We'll probably see this as we go through my CSP later on as well. So many organizations sort of lose track of what are all the dependencies. And some of them are pretty passive, they're images, but some of them are JavaScript. And then the JavaScript tentacles, let's say on my blog, reach all the way down into Discuss. And then there's weird things that happen down there on Discuss. And I ultimately am at the mercy of the likes of Discuss or Cloudflare or whoever it is I have a dependency on, to do nice things with their script. And I'm sure as we get into particularly the BA stuff, we'll see what happens when nice things no longer happen. So I hope that's a fun history lesson and a flashback to the
Your
90s
first book.
era of web development. Yeah.
I was going to, you just said 90s yourself there. I was about to say you are showing your age a little bit with some of the references there, perhaps, as long as you're okay with that.
I know. I'm fine with it. I'm happy in myself. I'm growing old disgracefully. It's fine.
One of the things that kind of stood out to me there as you were talking about that, and this might be a phrase that people have kind of come across, is the JavaScript supply chain. And you mentioned a lot of those dependencies there being external, so they can be third-party assets loaded from different domains, external domains. But you can also have kind of like first-party and arguably like second-party dependencies. So given that it'd be really easy for us to just host all of this JavaScript ourselves, and it's just file hosting, which should be easy in 2023, right? What are the kind of the different risks and benefits of having those external dependencies, and why do people do that?
Look, a couple of main things pop into my mind, and for everyone else's benefit as well, we sort of very broadly discussed what we're going to cover today, and the rest of it we're kind of ad-libbing, but I feel like we've done this a few times before. When I look at something like Have I Been Pwned, there are dependencies for things like jQuery. So, okay, I'm loading jQuery off Cloudflare's CDN. Why don't I just host it myself? Well, I could host it myself, and then I need to serve it, and I need to pay for the bandwidth. And in fact, one of the very early blog posts I wrote for Have I Been Pwned, it must have been 2014, was the thing suddenly started getting really popular. And I'm like, wow, I'm serving like many gigabytes worth of jQuery, which doesn't sound too bad until you look at the egress bandwidth costs of Azure, which what's the right phrase for it? Not very palatable. So it gets very expensive. So I was like, why am I paying for this? I could just chuck it all on the CDN and load it from there. Also, if I put it on the CDN, jQuery is so popular, and there are so many other organizations using Cloudflare CDN, there's going to be a bunch of people that browse to Have I Been Pwned, and they've already seen that jQuery library somewhere else, and it's probably going to be cached in their browser, and they won't have to load it, and everything will be faster. So that seemed like a good idea. But then, of course, I'm at the mercy of Cloudflare, who, well, I mean, look, let's face it, if we don't trust them to serve content properly, we've got bigger problems, right? But they're going to be pretty solid. But then also that there's all the other sort of JavaScript-based services which make a lot of sense to use. My blog uses Discuss. Now, how would I do a commenting engine without having an external dependency? Well, I've got to sort of build something into the platform, or maybe Ghost that I'm sitting on could have it, but even that's sort of a third-party dependency. Discuss is a ubiquitous commenting engine. I'd love to use that, and they sort of serve it up with this really nice turnkey. Just put a little bit of script on your blog, and we will take care of everything else. Now, Discuss is actually a fairly good example, because I had a time, ad networks are. I'm trying to think of the example, but I started getting redirected, or rather my visitors started getting redirected when they were on iOS to download Clash of Clans. I remember this specifically. Like, I had the traditional ad model, and then someone had come to read about security and privacy, and it's like, here's Clash of Clans, go for it. That's not a good look. And then I moved to sponsorship. But without going to the weeds of that, these models work, whether it's Discuss or whether it's traditional ad networks, by putting a piece of script, and then they're effectively saying, allow us to serve script to your visitors and run whatever we want in the browser. And the value proposition is it is a black box. It's like, you just put the tag on here, everything works, it's fine. The risk is the same thing, right? Like, you're trusting that organization to serve legitimate and valuable content. What I think is really fascinating when you and I do the workshops and we talk to individuals and say, look, are you happy for effectively the marketing department to run whatever script they want on your site? And they're like, no.
It's always marketing.
But that's what happens at the moment. That's the way it works. So I think there's those two use cases, like caching and serving commonly known files, and also just the as a service, which gets served up by JavaScript.
And I think that's the impractical one to do something about, right? Like, the static files like jQuery, maybe we could reasonably make the argument you could bring those in-house, and, the cost of bandwidth or, is so low, and you might have a provider in front of you like Cloudflare or otherwise doing caching for you. But then you come to the as a service things where, like, the Discuss comment system, which I also use, I have Stripe.js on many of my sites. I can't self-host. So I think, the security absolutist view is like bring all those assets in-house and control them. And I think the pragmatic view is actually, the JavaScript supply chain exists and it isn't going anywhere. So we have to kind of be able to do that and also deal with the risks. So that brings us nicely onto kind of, British Airways in what was happening on their side. It was very much the same thing, right? Like they had some of their own JavaScript assets that they would host themselves. They had some JavaScript assets where they kind of had their own application hosted internally, and they had many of their assets on that they would reference from their other applications. So they're kind of third party in that the application using those JavaScript tags was not the one hosting them, but it wasn't fully third party in that it was some completely external organization. And then they did have like your very traditional external third-party JavaScript dependencies, just like you do, just like I do, and probably everybody else on the call as well, if we were all to be honest. So the actual kind of problem with this was, yes, British Airways, did have a compromise on their CMS, and one of their JavaScript dependencies was modified. However, on the website that we all see, where you go buy airline tickets or the mobile app as well, the applications there were not compromised. It was the JavaScript dependency itself that was compromised and led to this breach. Now, there's a really kind of like clear distinction here, because obviously some of BA's infrastructure was compromised, and I want to be fully transparent. There's a level of compromise that can happen within your organization where, you're in really, really big trouble. However, I think it's fair, and Troy, you can challenge me on this. I think it's fair to say, given the nature of the compromise of this external CMS application and not the e-commerce application, it's reasonable to draw a comparison there that it's almost like a third-party script. Would you say that was reasonable for me to make that comparison?
Yeah, and I think folks who are sort of like, once you're owned, are possibly missing the nuance where there are degrees and shades of gray. And I mean, the BA one, like you say, it's a little bit unique because it was one of their own assets that was compromised, but it wasn't part of that primary site. It was another dependency. And I guess where we're heading with this is, are you resilient to when one part of your infrastructure is compromised, or does it bring down the whole house of cards?
So yeah, I think it's reasonable to kind of view this as an external compromise, because what we're saying is the e-commerce application itself wasn't compromised. And I'm sure if the attackers could have got in there, there's far more effective ways to do this. And one of the phrases that you used there, Troy, was like, when you're owned, you're owned. Like once they're in, you have way bigger fish to fry and you have way bigger issues to deal with. So with the British Airways breach, they managed to alter one singular JavaScript file. It was a modernizer.min.js like plugin JavaScript file. And the thing that the attackers were really careful to do when they modified this file was to add, number one, to add a very basic data skimmer. And I actually have a very, very similar copy of this data skimmer running on our demo site. So everybody can go to this. It's just report-uri-demo.com. And demo number 2 on both of these sections is I've tweaked the skimmer very, very slightly. So if anybody's interested in looking at how it functioned, you can actually take a look at that. This is actually a Magecart skimmer that I've put on our demo site. And in essence, all it is doing is listening to key press events and sending a request off out the back to a different domain. But the second crucial thing they did was leave the original functionality of the file intact. So when they got into the CMS, they were modifying the JavaScript file in order to add extra functionality, but not break the payment pages. And now, of course, the payment pages were the key ones that the attackers were interested in, because they're where users are typing in your full, 16-digit card number, address details, security codes, things like that. So this one simple JS file that was, designed as a little plugin, a little kind of like jQuery plugin, it doesn't really matter what that file was originally intended to do, does it, Troy? In that once they have access to a piece of JavaScript being loaded in that page, if they can, append or inject JavaScript into that file, that gives them essentially all of the power that they want. And then the only limit is their imagination in what they can do with that newfound power.
I think it's sort of fun to ask people the question and go, what can you do with JavaScript? And everyone sort of, because it's fun doing this in the workshops too, because you see everyone going, basically anything. It's like, geez, you see some of the amazing demos people do with JavaScript. It's like building entire virtual machines and emulating operating systems with JavaScript. It's not all about just putting snowflakes on the page or something like that.
Now, given the ability to like inject arbitrary scripts, and it's kind of interesting there. You say like, what can you do with JavaScript? I guess like maybe what can't you do with JavaScript? If you can copy and paste the code from Stack Overflow, then you can do anything, right? As long as you can write the JavaScript to do it. Yeah,
and it's like you're prone to saying, well, you're limited within the sandbox of the browser, and browsers are, you can't go and grab the cookies from a different domain for which it doesn't have access because of the browser sandbox security model. However, you can always just pop up little interstitial pages and ask for the credentials for someone's Facebook. And that sounds like stupid and obvious, etc. But geez, how many people fall for really obvious phishing sites, let alone things like that? So I think it's sort of fascinating just how much control you can have, if not technically, then socially with JavaScript.
And I think it's kind of important to point out as well, like this is Magecart's primary goal, is to steal card data. So we're here saying they have now the ability to put arbitrary JavaScript onto the page, and you can do effectively, within reason, anything you want with that. But Magecart's sole objective, their MO for the many, many years they've been doing this now, is to quietly sneak some JavaScript onto the page, leave no trace, and just quietly skim that card data off the back. And their goal is for that JavaScript to sit there for maybe days or weeks or months, and to skim as many cards as possible until they either get caught or they have enough cards where they think, okay, like, we're going to cash them out now. And they'll start loading all of those credit cards with fraudulent transactions to extract money. So the reason that Magecart did this particular attack is that is their MO. That is what they came for. They came for credit card data. And that is why they do it in such a stealthy way. And that's why they don't impact also the original functionality of the application. If you went to British Airways during this time and bought a ticket, you would get the ticket, you would go to the airport, and you would get on the airplane. It was just that the attackers took a copy of all of the data that you typed into the page at the same time. Now, fortunately, I think even listed here in the article, on the BBC, the JavaScript was modified on the 21st of August, but it wasn't noticed until the 5th of September. So this was a particularly short attack in terms of how long that malicious JavaScript file was sat there. But given the high volume of traffic going through both the website and the mobile app, because the mobile app was essentially a web view loading the same compromised file, there was a really significant number of people impacted by this. Now, given that they're on the page trying, they're skimming, we refer to this as data skimming nowadays. This data skimming attack, they're skimming, obviously, credit card data so they can see full card number, security code, expiration, and everything else. Wouldn't they have the ability to skim a lot more than that? If I was a few steps earlier typing in my username and password, this, should that not have been part of the breach? Or I frequently type in my passport details into airline websites because they usually ask me to do that. Would all of this additional data not have also been within the scope of the attack?
Well, I think maybe two things on that, because I just saw the comment from Mike here as well about CCV. One of the things that we find fascinating, every time you see one of these news articles that obviously relates back to Magecart and you see CCV listed as being compromised, I see so many people go, but you're not meant to collect that. You're not meant to store it anywhere. This is meant to be discarded straight away and not retained. It's like, yeah, but people have to enter it into like we've all bought things online, right? You have to enter it into the form. And I'm looking at the demo page here for Report URI at the moment. And you have to enter the CVV. Sorry, I keep saying CVV, because you need to do that as part of the purchase. And if you enter it into the page and you've got a skimmer looking for change events on every form and grabbing everything that's on there, well, yeah, of course you have it. Now, whether you then store it perpetually on the back end or not is a different story. That doesn't change the fact that someone had to enter it into the form. And I just feel, you've seen this before too, like time and time again, people are missing that bit. It's like whatever the humans enter into the screen, that's what's going to get grabbed. To the question about the other data, I guess it's a question of, first of all, what's useful. And I think in Magecart's model, I mean, they're stealing credit cards, right? I mean, that's their primary MO. But in all seriousness, why didn't they capture that? Like, we haven't set this up. Why didn't they not capture the names as well?
And so this is really interesting. I reverse engineered two very, very high profile and notable Magecart skimmers. And in both the British Airways case and the other very, very significant one, which was Ticketmaster, both of the skimmers would check the URL of the page that the JavaScript was running on, and they would only exfiltrate data on payment pages. And obviously, we've never caught any of them to ask, so I'm only giving my best hypothesis here. But it's to reduces the chances of detection. Like if you're exfiltrating every keystroke from every page and sending lots of stuff outbound, it would seem that it was more likely to be noticed. So obviously, if we ever find, Mr. and Mrs. Magecart, whoever they are, like we don't know, if we ever find them, we can ask them. But my biggest suspicion is that they're just trying to avoid detection for as long as possible, and therefore making the least amount of noise would seem to support that.
Yeah, right. Just minimize the footprint.
Yeah, absolutely. And, like Mike's kind of, there's two comments from Mike here now. So going to the one that you referred to about password managers autofilling. So looking at some of the more modern Magecart skimmers now, if we go like really early days like this, they were quite literally looking at key press events or key up events or change focus or things like that. Nowadays, they're far more sophisticated, and something like a password manager autofilling the form, unfortunately, will not save you, because they'll intercept things like the submission event, and then they'll just take a whole dump of the entire form itself without you having to literally click into a field and have key press events anyway. So whilst, yes, traditionally a password manager might have kind of accidentally saved you, nowadays, like Magecart have apparently grown wise to this, and they have developed and changed their skimmers over time. It's really interesting. The British Airways and Ticketmaster skimmers were very, very similar in terms of their code once we reversed them. But the problem with all of this, coming back to kind of the story here, Troy, is like, this is a data breach, right? Like, we talk about a Magecart attack or a data skimming attack, but ultimately, can we wrap this up in the banner of this is a data breach?
Oh, absolutely, because I think that the term data breach is a lot broader than what people think about. It's not just someone like SQL injecting your site and stealing all the data from the database. It includes everything, all the way through to someone leaves a laptop in a car with some corporate data on it. That's still a data breach. A thumb drive left laying around. So in this case, skimming off data on the way in. And if you look at it from the perspective of it's an unauthorized party obtaining data from an organization, particularly provided by customers, then yeah, absolutely, it's a data breach.
And as a result of that, it falls under all of the data breach regulation. Now, I've got the British Airways notice, like their press release and data breach notification. I've had to go to the Wayback Machine because they seem to have deleted this from their website. So this is a copy from the Internet Archive, because they have since deleted this. But they talk about here, like, the stolen data included personal financial details. So this is, whilst like a perhaps slightly different method of stealing data than what we might have seen traditionally, like Troy mentioned there, break into the database, SQL injection attacks. The TalkTalk breaches here in the UK were very significant losses of data via those mechanisms. It's still a data breach. This is just the new method of accessing the data, and it just so happens to be financial data because that's what this particular group of attackers were looking for. So because it's just the data breach, then all of your traditional kind of regulation and laws that, and this will vary depending on where you are, come into it. And the other Mike here in the chat has kind of just brought this point up as well, where, the ICO came out, and they're the Information Commissioner's Office here in the UK. They're our data privacy watchdog. And, this is a data breach. This organization has lost the personal and sensitive data of these hundreds of thousands of people. And they announced their intent to fine British Airways. Now, the original intent to fine, as you can see here, was £183 million. And this is pushing close to $200 million for those that may use different currencies. And this was significant. When this came out, even I remember being kind of shocked and like, wow, this is a significant fine. And it's only the intent to fine. Now, unfortunately, given the timeline here, it happened in 2018. The intent to fine came out 2019. And then we all know what was coming the following year that changed the face of the airline industry. And eventually, the actual fine, because of the impact of COVID on the airlines, was reduced to just £20 million. So this was quite a significant discount on the fine. which I'm not sure I entirely agree with. Like the fine was, the intent to fine was issued pre-COVID, and the fine came out at just £20 million. Now, given that this is one of the first big swings that a regulator took using GDPR to fine an organization, which of those two fines, Troy, like the actual intent to fine at 183 million, or the one that actually landed eventually, which was 20 million, do you think that was in line with what went wrong? Like, what happened?
It's an interesting one, and the first thing that sort of came into my mind, particularly as I saw Mike put the figures there, is how much did it actually cost? Because if you were to consider, I mean, geez, look at how much incident response alone costs, let alone, were there class actions against them as well for this? Because that's all the rage these days too. Let alone, all the sort of other intangibles, brand damage, reputation, so on and so forth. One would have to think that the actual cost of British Airways was probably a 3-digit millions of pounds anyway, regardless of the reduction in the fine. I kind of look at these fines as what is their purpose there? And actually, let me ask you a question, and I honestly don't know the answer. Why did you have to go to archive.org to see their statement? Why did they delete it?
Well, because I guess there was a lot of brand damage and they didn't want it to be constantly referenced and looked at, right?
And that's kind of where I was going. It's like, clearly this is something that they really, really wanted to go away, but it got a lot of press anyway. So I think the damage to them was far more significant than what the reduction in the fine implies. I suspect that damage, again, was significantly higher than the £20 million.
And this is kind of, part of the issue, like the regulatory fines from government organizations. You also mentioned there, like private action, class action, things like that from consumers that are affected. But then we also have kind of more interesting fines as well. So I found this tweet because Monzo was one of the few organizations to talk about this publicly, but we have a set of regulation called PCI DSS as well. So the payment card industry, which is like an industry body of Visa, American Express, MasterCard, all of the card issuers. And they set out something called DSS, which is the data security standard. And anybody who essentially in any way touches payment card data has to comply to some level of PCI DSS. And unfortunately, when something like this happens and you lose hundreds of thousands of card details, obviously all of those cards need to be reissued, like physically reprinted, reissued, and resent. And all of the fraudulent transactions need to be refunded. And this costs the card institutions a huge amount of money as well. So not only that, organizations like British Airways and then Ticketmaster then face fines for the cost of reissuing the cards, because, like out of interest, like how much do you think it costs to reprint a credit card and just ship it to someone? Like dollar cost, what would you peg that at?
I guess the actual mechanics of the card and the shipping it out, human effort, some single digit number of pounds per card.
So like on average, looking at the numbers, it's between $30 and $40 per card, all said and done, just for the physical act of printing it, scrapping the old one, sending the new one, and then the activation processes, somewhere between $30 and $40 a card. So if you lose like 490,000 cards, then that also stacks up to be quite an expensive journey. And that's before we get onto the cost of refunding any fraudulent transactions as well. So like you say, no matter which way we slice this, there's all the direct costs of fines, of class action, private action, regulatory fines, and then perhaps PCI stepping in. And the cost of a PFI as well, which is a PCI forensic investigation. You will also pick up the tab for one of those as the organization involved. Now, I just saw a question pop up in the chat here that was like, how was the script actually loaded on the site? And it was just like your super traditional script tag. So if we take a look here at the source of the Report URI site, and if I jump to the bottom where our script tags are, we don't have many, but it was just a script like this. And I can actually bring up so there's a really cool organization out there called Risk IQ, who did some fantastic work into the British Airways Magecart breach as well. And I can, I've actually got the script tag. This is a Medium article that I think one of their engineers perhaps wrote. So let me just zoom in on this one right here for you. So this was the actual URL that was loaded on their CMS, as you can see in the past. So it was just a super traditional script tag, nothing special. It was just that the application at that particular path, their CMS, where they hosted all of their JavaScript assets for other parts of their site was modified. So that's all that happened. There was nothing particularly special going on here. So
I think people almost sort of lose sight of how simple it actually is, isn't it? It's like you're loading a script tag. People put stuff in the script file. Like,
and then that's it, right? Like this, I gave a talk recently and I referred to this as the blank check of JavaScript. You know, this script tag says, go here and fetch whatever is there. It doesn't say what's there. There could be 1 kilobyte of JavaScript or 1 megabyte of JavaScript, and it can change today or tomorrow. Now, yes, this was one of their own domains, as we mentioned earlier, but this was on this path here, a separate application that was compromised to the one doing the e-commerce component. And unfortunately, that is all this takes. And I've noticed, I see that there are a lot of other questions here as well. We do have a dedicated Q&A section at the end, and we will come back and loop over a lot of these in a more open discussion. But to kind of bring this, back on, back onto the timeline for this, this is a big problem. Magecart themselves, before looking at any other hostile JavaScript attacks, Magecart themselves, with the sole purpose of stealing card data, have cost, hundreds of millions of dollars in fines and class actions. And even just looking at British Airways and the other one, Ticketmaster, that I mentioned, probably the two most notable Magecart breaches so far, they've quite literally cost organizations tens of millions of dollars for just those two incidents of we load a piece of JavaScript and somebody modified it. Now, the whole kind of purpose of Report URI is to help people set up one of the key defenses that we have against these attacks. And it is something called content security policy. And in two different ways, CSP, content security policy, is designed to mitigate exactly these kinds of attacks. So we're going to take a brief look and ask Troy to kind of walk us through the Have I Been Pwned content security policy. And I'm going to show you what the CSP looks like first in its raw form, and then I'll bring a slightly nicer form up. So if I take a look here at the actual page load on the Have I Been Pwned site, on Troy's site, you can see that we have a section of HTTP response headers. And one of those HTTP response headers is the feature that I just mentioned, something called content security policy. Now, the name kind of implies what it does. This is a security policy that is applied to the content on the page. And here in its raw form, it looks a little bit kind of wall of text. So we have an analyzer tool here on Report URI, and you can see that I've analyzed the haveibeenpwned.com site, and we're taking a look at their content security policy. So Troy, maybe you could just give us a quick overview of what CSP does and probably like what are the two main features around, script source and connect source that we might be looking to leverage here.
Yeah, well, I guess that the simple way to think about the content security policy here for Have I Been Pwned is let's say that nothing is allowed to load from anywhere. And this is really what our first default sources here does. It says, look, whether it's objects, because who doesn't want to embed Flash on a website these days, or scripts or styles or whatever else it may be, nothing is allowed to load at all from anywhere, not from yourself, not from an external party, nowhere. So it sort of says, look, let's go to a complete allow list kind of model by starting with nothing. And then we go down and we say, okay, look, I've got to have script. I can load scripts from my own website. I can load any scripts from my own website. And I can also load scripts from any of the other URLs listed there. And I don't know if we want to get into the weeds of a nonce or not, Scott. Do we want to go that deep?
Oh, that'll be another, that'll be a follow-up webinar.
Oh, upsell. Okay. So stay tuned for the next webinar. So I can also load scripts from places like Google Analytics. I really want to kill that. That's another story as well. As well as Cloudflare. And you mentioned Stripe before. I've got Stripe payments on Have I Been Pwned. I need to be able to load Stripe's JavaScript from js.stripe.com. So I have to go and explicitly allow it. And I think probably that the thing that's most noteworthy here is that if anyone tries to load script from any other location other than what is in this allow list, it just will not get loaded. We'll see it blocked and reported, just as you can see in the demo Report URI site from before. So going back to the sort of the Magecart example before, if someone did try to pull script from another location, that's not going to work. If I had a cross-site scripting vulnerability somewhere, that's not going to work. If someone injects a script tag because there's a comment form somewhere on the website and it doesn't parse the user input, That's not going to work. So the only way attackers can get script from an external source is to make sure that it's one of those ones listed there. Still possible, I guess, if someone compromised Cloudflare or Stripe, again, bigger problem's going to happen if we get to that stage.
Oh, yeah.
But you've just gone from any domain in the world through to a very, very, very finite set.
Well,
so we're really...
Carry on.
We're really just explicitly allowing sources. And do we want to go on yet, or did you have another comment on that, mate?
Well, I was just going to say, so let's make this a little bit more tricky, right? Because in the scenario that we just looked at, you would assume that if British Airways did have a content security policy, they were going to allow JavaScript to load from britishairways.com, being their own domain. So, like if we were looking at the British Airways CSP here, I would assume that one of these would say www.britishairways.com, and we can load JavaScript from one of our own, other applications as they were doing. And is there, in that scenario, assuming that script could come in, is there, what's the other way that CSP could help us? Is there another way?
Well, the question is then what? So if anyone's going to have a look at the skimming demo on Report URI, let's imagine that there's external script that's loaded. Some nasty stuff has gone into the external script so that when you're entering content into fields, it's going to then be exfiltrated off by our async request to another path. But that is an XML HTTP async style request to send it to another location. Yeah, let's actually have a look at the network tools here and see those requests. So as you
start typing in...
Oh, did that just show your real card? Can we go back and replay that?
Did it? I don't know. Maybe it did. But if it did, it's fine. Yeah, what can you do? Last 4 digits. It's so we go like
Question to the audience. What can we do with Scott's last 4 card digits?
Well, it's probably a security question somewhere, right? But
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you should always use fake credit card numbers as your security questions, maybe.
So let's just pick one of those. There we go. Right, so that has made an async request off to evilcyberhacker.com with that. Is that my website?
No, it's my one. I have hyphens.
Oh, you put dashes in it.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, copycat.
Were you going to go log my credit card number?
That 123 card number. I guess the point is because it's every keystroke that skimmer is sending that external request. So if we go back to my security policy in Report URI, and we spin down a little bit to connect sources, every one of those requests is a connect source. So just as I have an allow list for where script can be loaded from, I have an allow list for where async XML HTTP, did I get all the acronyms right there? XML HTTP, it's still early, XML JavaScript request can go to another path. Well, I've got an allow list there. So they can go to myself, they can go to pwned passwords because I integrate that from a different domain. And the other ones there are obvious as well. The Visual Studio one is Azure's Application Insights. So they're the only locations that those requests can go. So even if you did manage to modify one of the scripts, which was in my allow list, if you then tried to exfil data via HTTP request in that fashion, that's going to trigger the content security policy and it just wouldn't be allowed.
And this is how I've kind of slightly reconfigured the demo site for this. So this is the without demo or without CSP demo. So if I now go to the with a CSP demo, it's the exact same page. You can kind of diff them in your own time if you wish. But if I go in here now and do the same 1, 2, 3, 4 for the card number, you can see that first of all, the external request is trying to be sent, which demonstrates that the Magecart skimmer is still running on the page. So I've allowed the skimmer to still run to simulate the fact that it's coming from a trusted application. It's coming from one of my own applications. So the JavaScript is still running. So what's happening right now, and we're trying to show this, is the evil JavaScript is still running. Somehow, it doesn't matter how, but it is. And when it tries to exfiltrate data, that's the second stage at which you can catch this. Now, in an ideal world, that we would have caught this at the first stage. Stop the evil JavaScript on the way in. But just to show that there's a second line of defense here, we're catching the data on the way out. And you can see that all of these outbound exfiltration attempts are being blocked. It says blocked by CSP, 0 bytes were sent over the network. No data was stolen. So now even in the same scenario where we do have that malicious skimmer running on the site, we can still neutralize its data exfiltration capabilities, which neutralizes the data breach, because now, even though that JavaScript is there, no data breach is happening at this particular moment in time.
What I
So
love about this is it's a native feature in the browser, and the number of times you see people spend huge amounts of money on security controls and infrastructure and
yep.
services. And then you look at this and you go, well, what does this cost? And I'm sure we'll get to the report here, right? So this is in a moment. What does this cost to add a CSP? Well, it's some text in a header, like that's it. It is a native part of the browser. And I mean, there was a time we used to do these workshops, and then we'd talk about the support in the major browsers, and then Internet Explorer didn't do that. And now it's just there on everything and supported ubiquitously, and it's free, which is great.
And it's a really valid point, because we've Report URI, we've had a booth at a couple of conferences recently and exhibited, and people are like, okay, so, do we load your JavaScript agent, or do we install a server-side component? And the answer is quite literally no. You set that content security policy header, and you write the policy, and then you send the policy to the browser, and the browser is doing the enforcing. And as Troy said there, this is native functionality that we're leveraging. We're not deploying any code. There's no agent or component on the page or on the server or anywhere else. There is, Troy's not exaggerating there, is literally a line of text. And it might get a big line of text if you have lots of dependencies, but it is still just that line of text. Now, the final kind of piece of this puzzle then, and that kind of explanation I gave just there hinted at it, this is all done by the browser in the browser. If this were your application and this was happening on your page, you wouldn't have any knowledge of this unless you were sat looking at the network tab or the console of all of your users, which, we're not. So the final piece of the puzzle, and you can see it here in the network tab, was each time what we call a violation of the policy occurs. So if something happens that breaches the policy, a violation report is sent, and you can nominate the location where these reports are sent to. And this is what Report URI as a service can ingest for you. So the browser says, okay, look, I'm going to take that blocking action because this was not supposed to happen. I'm going to stop the data exfiltration. And then step number 2, I'm going to call back to your nominated endpoint and tell you that this just happened, that something unexpected is happening on this page. So this, for me, is the kind of final piece of the puzzle. And this is why, quite literally all of those years ago, I actually built and founded Report URI. Because having this mitigation and this capability in place is great, but really the actual solution to this problem, because you could arguably say the problem is solved right now, the card data wasn't stolen. But really, I view the solution as you need to go investigate, how did the JavaScript get there, and how do I remove it? And to me, that's the actual solution. But you need to know that the problem is actually occurring. And that's where these reports come in. So I'm logged into our demo account here. And if I just go to my CSP report section, and it looks like a few other people have been using the demo site because there's quite a lot of reports that have come through here. But you can now see all of these reports have been sent to us. We process the telemetry and it comes here into your account. And we can see on that page that I've just been showing you with the CSP demo, you can see that it is trying to exfiltrate data to these external domains. You can see we've tried to load a script from here. It tried to send data. Again, it tried to send data. And all of these violations have been reported back to us. So you know that number 1, whatever the data exfiltration was has been neutralized. The data was not stolen. But number 2, upon receiving these reports, and you can receive notifications from our service if something new like this happens that hasn't previously happened, you would receive that notification and be like, hey, our website just started sending data to a new location for the first time ever. Now, there's really only 2 scenarios. Number 1, your website is legitimately supposed to be sending data to this new location, in which case you can just clear the notification and say, yeah, we expected that, no problem. Or number 2, you would look at this and say, we weren't expecting our website to start sending data to a new location today, and we need to go and investigate that. So there's another webinar coming up in the future where we talk about the Ticketmaster Magecart breach, and it's a slightly different scenario. But even in this more tricky scenario now with the British Airways one, where yes, it was one of their own JavaScript assets that was compromised, and you could still reasonably make the argument that they would have allowed in their own policy, like we saw with Troy's on Have I Been Pwned, they would have allowed that JavaScript to load. We could still catch this attack at the data exfiltration stage, because there are always 2 stages to these attacks. Number 1, they have to get the evil JavaScript in. And then number 2, they have to get that customer data out for there to be a breach. And we can catch them at either one of those stages. So the demo site is set up there. You can see if you wish, and thank you to the person that shared the link in the chat that beat me to it. You can see both of those scenarios played out right here, and I have updated the demo page to mimic the British Airways site. You know, that piece of JavaScript is allowed to load, and even though we're loading hostile JavaScript on that page, it still cannot exfiltrate that data. So that kind of brings us to the end of the official kind of run sheet there. And what I want to do now is turn it over to kind of like a slightly more open format where people can ask Troy and I questions. I see there's already a few here, Troy, so maybe I'll just kind of scroll back actually through the Zoom chat log and maybe I'll pitch some of these over to you, if that's all right. If you do have any questions, now would be a great time to drop them into the chat as well.
Well, hey, let me take a stab at one of these while you're reading back, because you've been talking,
ahead.
I've been reading. So there was a good one in here about sub-resource integrity and where SRI fits in.
Yes.
And for those not familiar with this, sub-resource integrity allows you to take a JavaScript file, create a hash of it, put the hash on an attribute tag, or on a, let me try that again. It's still early, on an attribute of the script tag. And then when that JavaScript file loads, if it doesn't match the attribute on the script tag, it won't run. So it's pretty much a way of saying this is our known good version of script. If it changes, do not run the script. So SRI is fantastic for making sure that something remains as expected. And this was, Scott's going to pull up an example here. This was really one of the great ways of saying, I want to use a CDN for my common JavaScript library, but if that JavaScript library is compromised in any way, then don't load it. So look, SRI is fantastic in a way, and I feel like it's problematic in another way. It's fantastic for the reason just discussed. So if we look at the jCrew version that Scott's got highlighted on line 469 here, that integrity attribute is the SHA-256 hash of that file. If ever that file changes in an unexpected way, the script just won't run. So you can be dependent on cdn.report URI. In fact, that's a good example because that's obviously your own domain, but a little bit like the BA example.
Exactly.
It's part of your own domain, but it could get done, right? Could get pwned.
It is separate to our web app. Yeah. Like that is a separate instance that we just host those files on.
And I guess it's like a little bit of zero trust thinking where it's like, yes, it's my own and it should be fine. However, maybe it's not. So let's just, cover our bases. Anyway. Now, I think Mike made the point in response to that earlier on, is he said, look, the integrity might have been someone else. Apologies if it wasn't Mike. The integrity of that script file will be checked, but if that script file has another external dependency and that other external dependency gets changed, then SRI won't save you from that. The other thing is that SRI can be a bit of a maintenance challenge. In this case, it doesn't worry me too much because you're very specifically loading jQuery 3.5.1, the minimized version. If ever that changes, it's going to be 3.5.2 or something else. But you'll see there's lots of external services, and Browse Loud comes to mind. I don't know if I want to go in the weeds of that. But there's lots of external services where you're embedding like myproductname.js, no version. And then it could
really
change.
Popular one, stripe.js. How about that?
Well, that's a great example. And that could legitimately change due to the nature of them running the service. If you put SRI on it and it changes, then it breaks it. And then people go, oh, gee, well, that's kind of worrying. Like it could change. Like, yeah, it could, because you're giving all the control to some third party to do whatever they want with their script. And I think that's sort of the paradox.
So in short, kind of, SRI is great if you have a static asset that is version controlled. However, many things like Discuss, Stripe, Browse Aloud, and others that we've talked about, you are loading an externally dynamic file and therefore have no ability to version control it. The other problem with SRI that Troy also picked up on rightly was if a dependency of your dependency changes, you can SRI your dependency, but then your dependency can pull other dependencies and you can't kind of cascade SRI down through the JavaScript supply chain. You can only SRI your direct dependencies. So SRI is a great thing. I've linked to my article on it. Use it where you can. Yes, absolutely. But just know that there are those kind of little sharp edges.
That's a fair analogy. Sharp edges.
Yeah. I was trying to think of the diplomatically correct way of saying that. There was a quick question here about Report URI, which I can just pick up and tackle. So the offering that we supply is the reporting system, which you can include in your CSP. So yeah, if we take a look at the CSP on Have I Been Pwned again, you can see that the very last thing on Troy's policy there is where Troy nominates that if there is any violation of this policy, they are sent to Troy's unique subdomain, which you get to claim when you register an account. And yeah, that is where you simply request, look, this is the policy that we want to be enforced. And if something goes wrong, we would like you to send the notifications there. So yeah, it is quite literally that simple. As we said earlier, there's no other software or agents. That is also native browser functionality. Good one here from Mike, the second Mike. The biggest problem with CSP, in my experience, is bloat, and it goes back to what Scott said at the start. Marketing teams wanting a new tag manager or analytics thing deploying. And I can kind of, give my angle on this quickly and then hand over to Troy. But I think for me, because I deal with all of our enterprise customers and do professional services for our big clients, and I think you're kind of specifying two things there that are directly at odds at each other. On one hand, you're saying we want to control what code, what JavaScript is running on our site, and we want to make sure that it is good. And then on the other hand, you're saying, but we want people to have the ability to inject arbitrary code into our site without checking that it's good. And I totally appreciate the difficulty here, but we have to acknowledge that those two things that you want are fundamentally opposed. And this is, yes, like a very valid sticking point that I come across in almost every large client that we onboard. But what do you have anything to add to that, Troy? Like, what are your thoughts in dealing with that?
It's a paradox, and we have seen so many times in the workshops when we do CSPs that penny drop where you got a room full of 30 people, and many of them are seeing CSPs for the first time, and they're going, but the marketing department needs to be able to have like this tag manager where they just inject anything, like we can't break that on them. I'm like, well, hang on, so how much do you trust your marketing people, like full stop, let alone just with technical things? Like, how much do you trust your marketing? Are you sure you want them to be able to load anything from anywhere? And then they're like, holy crap, like I'd never thought about it that way. So, well, no CSP, that's what you can do. But it does, like, there's not an easy answer for it either, because that is very often their way of running campaigns and having a CMS where they can actually drop active script as well as just content. So there needs to be a change from them as well. And look, if they're not happy about it, maybe their fine will go from 180 million pounds down to 20, and it won't be so bad.
Fingers crossed. There is a follow-up point to that here that said you need to think about the risk. Pragmatism has a part to play, and I really strongly agree with this. We see a lot of people in the cybersec and infosec communities that are what I would refer to as security absolutists, and I really don't gel well with those kinds of approaches. Like I mentioned earlier, I work with some of our really big enterprise customers in terms of both onboarding and pro services afterwards. And one of the biggest things that I see us pushing towards now is to not even having an enforced policy. So content security policy is the header that we've deployed here, but there's a second version of the header, which is content security policy report only. And I'll drop it into the chat here now. And what this does, kind of as the name would imply, is it won't take any enforcing action, but it will still send the reports. It will send the report only. So you can drop this policy on the page, and this is a 100% safe way to test the policy because it will not block anything. Some people in the chat have also a couple of comments that I was going to come back to around breaking stuff. Yes, you can break things with CSP. If you block, like Troy mentioned earlier, your stripe.js, then your payments don't work. And that might be kind of important. So you deploy CSP, first of all, in a report-only mode. So it's completely safe, but it will still send the reports. And what we've kind of worked on, especially with some of our larger e-com and financial institution clients, is they were like, well, look, we have a refined policy. It's good. It works. But if something changes in the future, if marketing go add this new tag, which starts loading new JavaScript, rather than the CSP just nuke that JavaScript, because it's in report-only mode, the new JavaScript will be allowed to run. And we'll get the reports immediately if there is a new piece of JavaScript on the page. Now, we have a configurable feature on the site where we can alert you when you get new JavaScript dependencies. So you receive that alert and you might go, oh, you know what? It's just marketing. They've added a new tag. We'll go allow it in the policy, no sweat. Or if it's some kind of Magecart style event, you might look at that new dependency and go, wow, what is this? Like, why is this here? How did it get here? So yes, like there is, to kind of be fully open about this, like there is that period of time there where that script tag is loading and running, but you're going to know about it within a minute of the first page load that contains that new script dependency, which means if it's hostile, you can start taking action within that first minute rather than a week or a month like we saw with these Magecart attacks. So, like to try and balance the security versus the practicality of it, it's totally normal for really large organizations that are worried about the impact to only deploy in report only mode. They just want the rapid detection and alerting. And you don't necessarily have to even get to an enforced policy to extract all of the value, 99% of the value from this CSP.
But Scott, wouldn't marketing test it first?
Well, like, in your stringent environments and change control and everything, I'm sure. But, kind of like joke aside, even if they did, it might be in some like dev or test or pre-prod environment, right? But the minute you push that into production, it's, potentially like you could break something there, right? Like having a content security policy means like you can theoretically break something. So we've kind of softened.
But also, even if they did test it, it might change, right? Because they've got all those downstream dependencies where one thing requests another thing, and then the thing down there changes. And then we're back to the same uncomfortable position again, which is like, what do you mean something suddenly could change? Like, yeah, this is the way it's always worked. This is why this is now in a loop again. And
this is why so many of the big sites that use us now, and it's easy to see if a big site uses us, right? Because the headers are public and you can just go look. But so many of them now are just using us in report only mode because it's like, yeah, okay, look, if it's malicious JavaScript, it will be working, but we can know about it within minutes. Whereas before, if we got a new dependency, we might not know about it for days or weeks or even months. So for me, that report only policy has zero risk. You're never going to break anything. And you're getting kind of like 99% of the benefit because you've got that rapid alerting and detection capability. So yeah, like I totally agree to go back to Mike's original point here around balancing, these kind of like security absolutist views. And do you have to go to an enforced policy and take the risk of breaking things? I don't think that you do. If British Airways had this breach and it lasted for like 7 minutes, before they detected it and removed the JavaScript, I think that would have been a very different scenario than had it been the very large number of days. So I think that's a very balanced approach to take. I think we have time for maybe one more question, Troy. And, unless people are opposed to running over, and I guess they could just dial out, we do have a couple more. There was a really interesting one that I saw earlier that I want to kind of go all the way back to, which was around like how was the British Airways one actually detected, essentially, is what the question boiled down to. And the same with the British Airways and Ticketmaster and all of the other big ones is once the attackers start to load those cards with fraudulent transactions, if a bank has thousands of customers that suddenly get a $100 fraudulent transaction, they can spot that pattern very, very quickly. And I've only had a little bit of involvement with this, but in something called the PFI, which is the PCI Forensic Investigation, they run something called a CPP report, which is a common point of purchase report. So they take all of those cards with fraudulent transactions and they go backwards through all of their previous transactions until they find the one place that all of those cards have been used within recent history. And that is how you nail the source of the breach. So that common point of purchase in all of the card histories was how big Magecart attacks like this come to light, but only once the cards have been hit with those fraudulent transactions.
Yeah, that's what was going around the back of my head. It's like, yes, this is how it gets detected after things have gone really, really wrong. We're trying to like not get to that point in the first place.
It's like the worst place to find this, right? Totally agree. But that is the common point of purchase is what tips the hands here. And it's really funny because sometimes the financial institutions, like with Ticketmaster, and a lot of this information is public if you know where to look, they will get in touch with the organization and be like, hey, you've had a breach because 8,000 of our customers got fraudulent transactions and the only one place that all of them have shopped is with you. And then, it's like the organization is finding out from the card provider. And we're so far down the road there. There are many points prior to that where this should have been picked up.
And that's the Monzo tweet, right?
So for the British Airways one, yes. And do you know what? Monzo are really on top of this stuff. For a lot of the other big Magecart ones, it's also been Monzo that's notified the merchant that they've been breached. So I don't know what Monzo are doing, but they should keep eating their Weetabix in the morning and keep doing it, because they're really on the game.
For the international viewers, is Monzo just like an online bank, like not in-person bank?
Yeah, just virtual only.
Right. Okay. High tech, I guess.
Did you see any other questions that jumped out at you, Troy?
No, I sort of liked Armin's comment here before about just follow the money, and it kind of leads you back to the source. Look, I think there's some really interesting comments here from people that have obviously been deploying CSPs as well. And to me, like the pragmatism stands out a lot, where and to your point as well about a lot of organizations running a report only, that this isn't about just kill all the things and turn on all the things and no one shall pass. That there's got to be a practical middle ground. And I would suggest that depending on the nature of the service, that's going to be really different. Look, have I been pwned? I'm really the only one that can screw that up. Like I'm the only one putting stuff there. So I don't mind being pretty strict about that. But if you are in an organization that's either got a lot of external dependencies that could change, or you have the marketing department, which we joke about, but it's a real thing. That might be something you want to be a bit more cautious about. Hey, I did see one other comment actually, which you might want to respond to, which was around might you have a different policy on one page as opposed to the whole site?
Yeah, absolutely. So content security policy has no memory effect, and it's delivered and enforced on a per page basis. So in theory, every single page on your site can have a different CSP because it has different stuff on it. Now, that's a super impractical way to do it. And, 99.9% of the deployments that I work on, an organization will write one global policy that applies to the whole site. And if you take a look at Report URI, we're in basically exactly the same boat. We have, same on Have I Been Pwned as well, I noticed with yours, Troy. We have a list of acceptable sources, and those sources are acceptable on any page. So whilst theoretically you could reduce the CSP, for example, if this page doesn't use reCAPTCHA, we don't need to put the Google reCAPTCHA script on it. That is completely impractical, and I would never encourage anybody to go down that road unless you had a very good reason. So yes, it is delivered and enforced on a per page basis. You might have a CSP now, and then on the next page load, you might not have one, or you might have a different one. So for me, the best approach is a kind of site-wide CSP delivered on all pages that encompasses what you deem to be your list of acceptable sources of content.
And also, I mean, if you think about that example, it's like this one page I'm not going to use reCAPTCHA on, so I'm not going to allow sources from whatever the Google domain is. That really the only benefit that's going to give you there is that if on that particular page someone did manage to get something malicious onto one of Google's domains, and again we're sort of back in the realm of there's going to be much bigger problems impacting a huge number of people. It's going to be found very quickly.
Absolutely. And if you trust that resource, you're probably going to trust it across your whole site. I can't think of any reasonable scenarios where you would trust a piece of JavaScript on one page, but not on another. It seems slightly outside the realms of being plausible. So I've just dropped a few links in the chat there. So there's the two first ones, PCI DSS compliance and Magecart protection, are very relevant to the topics covered today. And the two alerting features for new JavaScript dependencies or external data dependencies, I've also linked those two products as well. If you do want to try and get started with CSP, I've linked you to our previous webinar, which goes through the entire process of trying, to go from nothing, which most people have, to a somewhat reasonable CSP, which we managed to get done in 31 minutes in that webinar. So that's pretty good. Question here just came through. Perhaps report only everywhere but the payment page. So this is I would agree with this. I think that is a reasonable approach. And I might even go one step further and say, what about no CSP anywhere except the payment page? If you're just going for the high value target, which is your payment page or your authentication page, for most organizations, for most websites, maybe you just write a CSP for those too. And, maybe that's enough. Now, I appreciate not everybody loves talking about cool things like compliance, but if we look at PCI DSS compliance, the new version that comes out in March 2025, so like a year and a half from now, it's almost, without naming it, requiring a CSP. They say you have to have a method to authorize any JavaScript on the payment page. And CSP drops into that definition almost perfectly, but it doesn't say all pages on the site. It says on the payment page, because that's the high value target. So for me, I might try and say something like, well, maybe we just do the payment page and authentication and account pages where we have the user's name and address or something. Go for the high value targets first. Your homepage, what's on there? Is anybody going to keylog your homepage? I don't know. Take a look. Maybe, maybe not.
Hey, the only thing I find a bit interesting with that, Scott, is that if you control something upstream of the payment page and you can control the flow of traffic to the payment page, surely there are some interesting options available then as well.
In what regard? Sorry.
Well, if the homepage is compromised and people land on the homepage and then they click the payment link and you can control where the payment link goes.
Yeah. I mean, if you're in an enforced mode, like you could stop something like that. But if we've got hostile content in the page that's directing the user off, they could just like full reskin, perfect rip off. I think most people would reasonably fall. I think I would probably fall for that because I don't check the domain when I'm clicking around.
And then you don't know what it's meant to be, even if you do.
Yeah, that's also true. I'm a user and I'm unreliable. And that's why none of these things should depend on the user. So yeah, so like Armin's just mentioned basically the exact same thing here. And actually, when you mentioned PayPal, you reminded me of a comment earlier. And somebody was saying, well, like, what about just essentially not having the payment page on your site? Now, ultimately, this is like the best way of dealing with this particular problem is to just completely farm it out. Don't even have the payment form on your site, and then just click the link and redirect the user away after some payment portal. But for the exact same problem that Troy's just mentioned there, the new PCI DSS requirements are looking at, well, how do we know that that link goes to a legitimate payment form on another domain? So you still have to have some control exerted over that page, even if you're just going to send the user away somewhere else, because you could just be sending the user away to anywhere. So there are still, as I said earlier, PCI DSS is like a sliding scale. You might have a minimal set of requirements, you might have a huge set of requirements, but somewhere in there, by 2025, you're going to have to do something about the problem of Magecart. All right. Well, I think for me, so Sean's just mentioned CoinHive. Troy, do you know anything about CoinHive? That's a separate webinar. Let's not pull that thread and unravel that story. And Mike's also just mentioned Browse Aloud, which will be actually covered as part of the Ticketmaster Magecart hack. That will be covered. No, that Browse Aloud was the ICO cryptojacking one, wasn't it? Sorry. There's so many hacks. I get them all mixed up. Oh gosh,
there's
that's
so many
to say, is
it? I'm going to do my video, I think, like 15 minutes after we finish this. So if anyone wants to come and ask random, unrelated stuff there, I have a lot less structure than Scott.
Yes,
so
let's do it.
Feel free to join that.
For now, though, I just want to thank everyone that's come. The numbers have held really consistently high throughout, which I'm super, super pleased about. This is only the second ever webinar that we've done. We will be announcing another one shortly. So if you registered for this one and you didn't unsubscribe from our mailing list, you will receive an invitation to the next one as well. So if you've enjoyed this, then there will be more kind of follow-ups on the Ticketmaster breach, the cryptojacking ICO breach, and also just some more practical, implementation tips and steps as well. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you, Troy, for taking what turned out to be just over an hour out to come and join us. And thanks to everybody for the questions in the chat that have kept us going past the end time. I'm available via email and all the usual social channels, as is Troy. We've shown him on haveibeenpwned.com. You can also find him on his own site at troyhunt.com as well. So go have a look on Twitter. As Troy's just mentioned, he'll be going live with his weekly updates very, very shortly. And I will actually be jumping over and joining in on that as well. I've seen all the nice comments here in the chat. Thank you so much for everyone. Our hater, Mihal, who's jumped in as well. Ex-Report URI staffer. If you need to know anything about CSP or cybersecurity, you should absolutely hit him up on the socials as well. But I'm going to wrap it up and say thank you very much to everyone. And hopefully we'll see you on the next one. And thank you, Troy.
Thanks, mate. See you, everyone.